Hey guys, welcome back to the first and last podcast on the internet that takes video game criticism so seriously that I've got sports drink with me. That's the kind of shit we're doing today. My name is David. I'm the editor-in-chief at ZeroIndent, and I'm joined by my special guest, ThatBoyAqua. We got Nolan in the house. What's up, man?
Hi. It's doing good.
I've dragged you into this. This is your first podcast, isn't it? Technically,
It is. It's my first time doing any sort of podcast, and my first time on somebody else's podcast.
I promise not to embarrass you too much.
It's like Let's Plays without the video games, though. So I feel like I could work my way into it.
I've actually done several years to prep for this.
Exactly.
I don't want to brag, but I'm in the gym every day, Let's Playing. Look, the reason I brought you on is we're talking about something that you've talked about before. It's near and dear to your heart. In this two-parter, we're going to be covering one of the single best reviewed video games in recent memory, and then also one of the more controversial ones. We're talking about Arkham Knight in the Batman Arkham series. Talk to me about like your experience with this game. I know we talked about it briefly the other day, but give me like what's your relationship to this game like?
Basically, as far as the Arkham series goes, like since Asylum, I was on board with it. I remember I actually wasn't interested in Asylum at all, but my father at the time bought it for me because I was young I don't remember how old I was. That came out 2009, 2008.
I want to say like 2011 maybe.
Okay, like then I was probably like 10 years old or something like that. So I've been playing it for a while, and then loved City, loved Origins, and when Night came out, I loved that too. And I thought it was the best in the series. I thought there's no way they could have topped City and Origins, but they did. And then I watched some reviews online. I was like, oh shit, this is not.
Yeah, turns out you had the bad take.
Yeah, essentially.
It was a very controversial one when it dropped. I do remember that.
And I think the main reason for that is that I had basically my only exposure to Batman has been through those games and through like the Dark Knight and the movies and whatnot. I actually never watched Batman as a kid, like the cartoons and whatnot, because they actually scared me.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Wait, what specifically? Was it the bats? Like
it was there was a show called The Batman, and it had like this really weird version of the Joker, where he was like, okay. I can't remember who voiced him, but yeah, and I just remember it kind of scared the shit out of me when I was a kid, and so I didn't watch it. And as far as Arkham Knight goes, like I just had no issues, because I guess biggest issue would be the Arkham Knight's identity, which I've been told that if you've read a comic was very obvious, but for me, I was sitting there, I'd look at the character profiles, and it would say the Arkham Knight's height and weight, and I'd be comparing it with other characters.
And to be like, is it someone we've met before?
Yeah, so I remember looking through the database, and I saw Cash, the guy with the hook hand.
Yeah.
His stats are like very similar to the Arkham Knights. And I was like,
he would have been a good pick.
And I was like, oh, maybe it's him. Like maybe he got all pissed off at Batman.
He's in City and Asylum.
Yeah.
He's a good pick actually. That's a good pitch.
And so I was actually theorizing who it could be.
Yeah, damn. Okay. Well, now I'm like that. That's definitely a better pick. We'll talk about that and the ending in part 2. But I guess to get started, I'm gonna tell you about probably one of the most prominent, successful writers at DC that no one's ever heard of. And then we'll kind of go from there and kind of work out how they got to making this sequel. So we'll start, as we always do, with our protagonist. Patricia and Robert gave birth to Paul Dini on August 7, 1957. Paul made his way through Stevenson School on an arts scholarship and matriculated to Emerson College in Boston, where he completed his BFA on creative writing. Shout out to people who studied a creative writing degree out there getting it. While studying, Paul worked on freelance animation scripts for Filmation. Filmation worked on everything from Star Trek the Animated Series to like He-Man, the Batman Superman Owl, which was probably just before your time, and then the New Adventures of Superman. These, like, it's hard to explain, but these were like, you know how a lot of companies like Nickelodeon or Cartoon Network, they have these kind of cheaper animation studios that just pump out like 1 million cartoons a year.
Yeah.
These guys were like one of those studios that did that stuff. And so it was like a really great opportunity if you were any kind of creative to just get a ton of runs on the board, if you know what I mean. It's like there's just projects coming out the arse, and you're there pumping them out, trying to get them out. And so that was where he got his start. And he started working on He-Man. Did you ever watch He-Man as a kid?
No, I didn't.
Damn, it was probably before your time, but it was the cheesiest. Like, you know, he was this prince that he had this magic power that let him get buff, and he became He-Man, who was like this buff kind of superhero.
He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. I am Adam, Prince of Eternia and defender of the secrets of Castle Grayskull. This is Cringer, my fearless friend. Fabulous secret powers were revealed to me the day I held aloft my magic sword and said, "By the power of Grayskull."
Which is pretty fun. And the Dini did eventually move on to Star Wars, Transformers, and G.I. Joe. So he was doing a lot of kind of not comic book stuff, but comic book adjacent, if that makes sense. And I think the most notable part of his career, which is where we're getting to, is his work on Batman the Animated Series. So working with Bruce Timm, he wrote quite a few episodes for that show and kind of set the tone of the program. Did you ever watch, or have you watched since the animated series?
No, not much. I've seen clips online and whatnot, but nothing, not too much of it.
It's sort of like, it's referenced as like the inspiration for all modern Batman stuff.
Oh yeah.
Like it set the tone, like the characterization. You had, Mark Hamill as the Joker, and you had Kevin Conroy as Batman, and like it's just these iconic characters, man, and like it really rewrote the source material. And Paul Dini's actually the guy who wrote the episode The Joker's Favor in 1994. And The Joker's Favor introduced Harleen Quinzel, a new psychiatrist who began treating the Joker, and he eventually seduces her, and she becomes the iconic and famous Harley Quinn. So this guy we're talking about, Paul Dini, invents one of the biggest characters in the Batman, mythos to this day, right? Huge. Yeah. She's got her own movies now, she's played by Margot Robbie. But Paul's, he's this relative unknown at the time, and he just comes up with this idea, and between him and Bruce Timm, they put it out there. And, Paul Dini's strength in those days was the ability to introduce fresh ideas into these existing properties without it feeling like kind of fan fiction-y or hacky. I feel like sometimes, and maybe this is a personal taste thing, sometimes when it's like, they're doing something new in Star Wars, it sometimes can feel not fan fiction-y, but it feels, they're like, here's this new element that ties into this old thing, and you're like, yeah, I get, of course it does. Like, why wouldn't it? Nothing can just be a new idea.
Yeah.
I feel like he escaped that pretty well. So on creating Harley Quinn, when he was speaking with EW, Paul Dini said, quote, I pitched it to Bruce Timm and Alan Burnett, and Bruce was like, that sounds like fun. So I wrote the script, and Bruce did the design of her in the classic Jester outfit, and everything just clicked. We really liked how the episode came out. Not only was the main story a lot of fun, but Harley was a character who really seemed to pop. So the next time we did a Joker story and he needed a big gang of hench people, there was Harley. I think the audience just began to expect her. They liked her and thought she was funny. Arlene Sorkin's voice certainly gave a great deal of life and dazzle to the character. End quote. She would go on to voice this character repeatedly in a lot of incarnations. In my mind, she is the voice of Harley Quinn.
Here's to Gotham's Commissioner G. You lock up the weirdos, the crooks, and the geeks. You're a hero to all the boys in blue. But this time, baby, the joke's on you.
And I think it's fairly telling that two of the most renowned cartoon creators, Bruce Timm and Eric Radomski, repeatedly brought Dini in for all of these projects, right? He was their go-to man. They sort of constructed, I don't know if most people aren't aware of this, but they constructed this like DC animated universe for a while in the early 2000s where the Batman, this various Batman TV show actually existed in the same universe as this Superman one. And they're all, tied together by a Justice League show or something like that. Which kind of superseded the Marvel MCU stuff, but in animation, which is kind of interesting because I think a lot of the time now, Marvel gets a lot of credit for being the first ones to be like, what if it was all in the same universe? Yeah. But DC kind of they kind of started the trend, and just happened to be that it wasn't in live action. So Tim and Dini subsequently created Freakazoid, which is a cartoon about a 16-year-old geeky boy, Dexter Douglas. And like every superhero that is created in sort of this early 2000s era, Freakazoid's fucking weird, man. So let me pitch you this superhero, and you tell me if you've watched
with a name like
this.
Freakazoid, my expectations are low.
Yeah, and also a name like Dexter Douglas, like Bruce Banner. You know, the two, like the double, the alliteration on the name is great. So Dexter gains powers from a computer bug that's set off by a secret key sequence. Dexter is then absorbed into the computer and gains all of the information on the internet, as well as your standard like superhero abilities like strength, endurance, and speed. But when he transforms into Freakazoid, he also like loses his sanity, which was the twist. So, you know, he's like this powerful force for like fighting crime, but he gets distracted or like forgets what he's doing all the time. It's very weird. It's just, he had a base called the Freakalair, which was like a parody of the Batcave. And it was built by his mutant butler, Ingmar. And the Freakalair contains, this is, by the way, one of my favorite names of anything ever. Quote, a hall of nifty things to know.
Okay.
Which is great, and even a mad scientist lab. His greatest weakness, as he once explained to Armando Gutierrez, is that he can be imprisoned in a cage with graphite bars charged with negative ions. Which...
That's like oddly specific.
Very specific. Like, yeah, kryptonite, I get, is like, but a cage with graphite bars charged with... Like, that is... I did chemistry and physics, but I only kind of know what that means. Very specific, and would be hard to trap a very quick, strong guy in there. He also expressed an aversion to poo gas, so that's the kind of cartoon we're dealing with.
Okay.
You down here! Surprise! Ah! Ooh, ooh, ooh! Now unzip your head.
Huh?
Unzip your head, you know, like this. Pretty gross, huh, kids?
Don't do that!
Don't do what?
Stop unzipping my head! No, no, no!
Dexter, open the door, you little dip. I gotta make Tinky.
Well, hi, sport. You must be Duncan. Good to meet ya. Let's wrestle.
Oh, golly. You know how long it's been since I've heard the boys roughhouse.
Ow! Say uncle.
Uncle!
Say, Grandma Moses makes munchy meat most Monday mornings.
Grandma Moses makes munch. I can't.
Wait. Shh, 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 shh. What is that noise? I'll be right back. Would you please stop that infernal raking? It's driving me crazy. Sheesh.
And so this is sort of one of Dini and Tim's original superhero ideas. And so it's no kind of small wonder that as time goes on, they get pushed increasingly onto the DC projects, because as a pitch, this was not necessarily the most successful, as you could imagine. I can't tell. I've watched a few episodes in research for this. I can't tell if it's satire or not. You know what it's like? It's got that like edgy 90s thing going on, but I can't tell if it's kidding or if they're actually serious about it. And I'm scared to find out.
Yeah.
It's bizarre, man. And like, you know, it's clearly, you can tell that it's a parody of all the shows they're working. Like, you can tell that like there's obvious nods to like the Batcave and Superman and like references and stuff. But it's hard to tell if the actual show is taking itself seriously or not. But I guess the point there is that Dini and Tim once again have that ability to like manipulate these comic book tropes, and are like really talented in the exact thing that they do together.
Yeah.
And they kind of keep Dini in the DC loop. This happens a lot in this era where it's like if you write one really good book, they just kind of bring you on to everything. So in the early 2000s, Paul Dini worked on comic books and a handful of other animated shows. He eventually did work again with Bruce Timm on Harley and Ivy, which was a limited run series for DC in 2004. It's actually extremely good. It's sort of a spin-off from the animated series. He wrote a lot of... Actually, Paul Dini wrote a ton of Batman, like, one-shot comics, while Grant Morrison was doing his, like, huge, languid 7-year run of Batman. It was this really weird thing where they just gave Grant Morrison the mainline comics for, like, 7 years, and then everyone else was writing one-shots. But when Morrison concluded his run with Batman R.I.P., DC shuffled all their writers around, and Paul Dini ended up running 2 Batman comics. He did The Streets of Gotham and Gotham City Sirens. And this particular area of his career is kind of tricky to pick through, right? I should point out that he worked a lot in a short amount of time, just based on like his credited his referenced credits. He did things like the DC Weekly Series Countdown. He wrote a movie called Ninja Team Gatchaman that never saw the light of day. He did a Madame Mirage series, just a ton of like really weird fringe DC properties. Yeah. He even went into the route of like trying to like, I guess, bring animation to the people, right? He launched this weird website with these 2 characters, Super Rika and Rashi, which was an animated show that he made every week, but where you could like log into the site and use their very rudimentary animation tools to make your own stories, which was huge in that era. I remember that as that stuff as a kid for sure. Like, you know, you'd go off to school and you'd have these like Flash filmmaking tools that were all, you know, in browser and stuff like that. But this brings us to about 2007 or so, and sort of the start of what's going to happen next and why we're talking about all of this. So Dini has an impressive career already. I don't think that goes without saying. While never reaching the heights of contemporaries like Frank Miller or Grant Morrison, Dini is one of DC's most consistent getting it done writers. And these are the guys who, they're not going to get the huge credits. No one remembers Paul Dini's name that isn't a diehard fan of DC, but he's one of their workhorses that has just produced so much amazing material for them. So in spring 2007, when Edios obtained the rights to make a Batman game, DC Comics approached Paul Dini. He seemed to be the man who could take anything and adapt it to the correct property that they needed. And Dini kind of points out to them that up until that point, there are very few Batman games that were based on original ideas. They tended to either be adaptations of existing properties, so like movies or direct adaptations of comics. There was a few Flash games that did that as well. Yeah. But Edios ended up signing with Rocksteady Studios, at the time a small, fairly unknown British game studio, and they decided to bring Paul Dini on to write the main story for the game. Dini worked closely with Rocksteady and had already suggested... Dini worked closely with Rocksteady, and they'd already suggested this idea of setting the game in the Asylum for a lot of reasons, chiefly technical. I think from a scale perspective, it seemed like an achievable goal, but also it was pretty ripe with opportunity to explore like a lot of the Rogues Gallery, which you do see in that final product. Dini's story centralized the Joker's relationship with Batman, turning out to be a really, really great fit for the gameplay and the concepts that the team were already working on. And, I think, and this is kind of speculation, but I think the reason that Paul Dini was a really good fit here is that, his experience writing the relationship between Joker and Batman, and particularly Harley Quinn as well, like he's the guy that you would get if you were trying to adapt them to a different medium. Like if they ever had to do something different with it, he's the guy that you'd probably hire. It's weird to me that they don't get him involved in more of their like live action stuff.
Well, and it seems like it would make sense too, because as you mentioned with things like Freakazoid, like he very much had a good understanding of the comic book tropes and whatnot, and clearly that's what Arkham Asylum was going for, was kind of that mix between realism and, I guess, comic book style. And so I think having someone like that who obviously understands comic books and the tropes and all the characters that are involved in Batman's Rogues Gallery, I think is super cool.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, he's like, you couldn't get a better person for this job, in my opinion. And so it's a little coincidence with Dini on the script. The development team decided to bring back Conroy, Hamill, and Sorkin to reprise their roles as the 3 key cast members of the story. And this is where the lightning in the bottle starts to happen. After 21 months of development, 60 people at Rocksteady completed Batman Arkham Asylum, which released on the 25th of August 2009. So you were right, it was 2009. This game blew critics away. It somehow captured the soul of the best Dark Knight stories while giving the player a sense of power and vulnerability. The writing and gameplay sort of perfectly complemented each other, and the voice cast turned into one of the best performances of each of their respective careers since the animated series. The game sold incredibly well. Guess how many units it sold in the first 2 months of its release?
What, like 800,000?
2.5 million.
Oh my god.
Yeah. This game was gangbusters, man.
I knew it was popular. I did not know in the first 2 months it did that well.
Yeah. I think it was like, in part, it was a really, really good marketing campaign.
Oh yeah.
But also in part, like it permeated the culture. I don't know, something about it. Particularly at that point, like, 2009 was a weird era for this kind of thing, because unless the marketing hit you directly, there's chances that you just don't find out about this stuff for a long time.
Yeah.
This was before every single game release was talked about extensively, in every forum, or, like before you saw these trailers at E3, it was kind of like you found out about games either through, because you're a hobbyist and you read the magazines.
Yeah.
Or they just kind of came out and you saw them on the shelves. But they did such a good job with this marketing because they had Warner Brothers money that it just kind of fell into place. And as you can imagine, like the accolades for the acting and the story and the gameplay followed pretty quickly after. I won't go through all of them because there's literally too many to list here.
Yeah.
But it was praised for everything from its writing, combat, and stealth, and even picked up a handful of awards for things like sound design and graphics and style. I don't know if there was some awards around the sound design stuff that I was like, I don't know if I necessarily agree with, but
like
for the most part, there was a few where it was like technical achievement in sound design, which is normally like saved for when someone does something new with the tech. So like The Last of Us Part 2 won some awards for some of the physics sound stuff they did and like the glass breaking physics. And this game won a similar one, but there isn't really a lot of physics in the game, so I don't really understand, like, just some stuff where it's like clearly early game award stuff. Where like we need to give it to someone, and that game slapped. It's kind of my takeaway.
The gadgets, I mean, they sound good though.
Oh,
like the grappling hook sound is still like
It's so good.
So good.
I love the batarang, like the shink as you throw it. Oh, it's a beautiful sound.
Or the explosive gel.
The explosive gel.
So satisfying.
That's weird. The explosive gel was a mechanic or like a thing they introduced that then just like found its way back into the comics, which is kind of interesting to me. Like this game was so popular that much like the animated series, it started to inform the source material, and this explosive gel starts to appear in the comics as well, which is pretty cool to me.
Yeah.
Like I think that's really cool. But obviously with this success, the studio starts working on a sequel like straight away. Turns out actually earlier than everyone thought, because they knew they wanted to continue the story. The first game actually includes a secret room containing blueprints and concept art for the next game.
Yeah.
And no one discovered this. It was actually until 6 months after the game was released that Rocksteady themselves revealed the secret room, because they'd hidden it so well that no one could find it, which is fucking funny to me. That they're like, guys, here's this secret room. Wait, it's going to be great. Someone's going to find it. And they're just like, You can imagine them sitting there at month 5 being like, no one's found it yet, huh? That would be so stressful to me.
Well, even when I like knew where to go, because I remember sitting there, at my friend's house, like shitting my pants because we found this like all these blueprints for Arkham City and whatnot. And like when we were looking up a YouTube video on how to get there, like I guess I placed the explosive gel wrong, because you have to place 3 different sprays on there on the same wall, and I found it kind of weird to get to. And fun fact, I believe it's not in the Return to Arkham remaster.
Interesting.
PS4. Either that or my 10 minutes of bashing my head into that wall just didn't
gave up.
result in anything.
Yeah, okay, interesting. That wouldn't surprise me, because it was one of those things that they did without really asking Warner Brothers. So we'll talk about it when we talk about the marketing campaign for Arkham City, but like, it's sort of not a cool move for the studio to put something like that in without telling the publisher. Like, it's not. No, I'm sure no one got in trouble for it, but it's kind of like, guys, that's not how this works. Like, you can't just sort of sneak that shit in. These days, it's a whole different story where everything has to be part of a franchise. Like, you have to always be seeding the next thing.
Yeah.
Back then, it was just kind of a faux pas to do that without getting permission, which I kind of love for Rocksteady. It's like kind of their Rockstar moment, I think, where they just like, they go out of their way to do something kind of cool. But obviously with this room, it led to rampant speculation. And there's an end credit scene too, where either Scarecrow or the Killer Croc survives and sort of floats off the island, or I think the hand comes out to...
Yeah, Bane does
whatever
too.
that. Yeah. Which again is planting the concept for a sequel. But so pretty quickly in February 2009, after a bit of a break, the studio got to work on Arkham City, the sequel. Paul Dini returned to his role and committed to raising the personal and the story stakes of the narrative. Where Asylum confirmed the structure and format of the series from a gameplay perspective, Arkham City presented a unique opportunity to create a game where you experience what it's like to be Batman in Gotham City. And speaking with Game Astura, Paul Dini described the process for the Arkham games as follows. Quote, "Somebody always has a better idea on how to approach a scene, so you have to be open to that and very, very fluid. So I work with some terrific writers and designers. I want to give a shout out to Paul Crocker, who's our head of story on the Batman games, and he's really amazing and shoulders a lot of the burden as far as the writing of it. Every time we do a game, I sit down with him and with the gang in London, and we come up with the ideas. I go off and write a treatment, and then they break it down as far as scenes and everything. It's very collaborative, and much more so than a movie, because you're writing for, a lot of people are going to be doing a lot of things to determine the stories you're telling throughout the game. It's more than just our story." End quote. I think in general, the impression I've come to, having read way too many interviews with Paul Dini and Dax Jin, who was the marketing manager at Rocksteady, and particularly Sefton Hill, who was the game director, is that the way that this team works is they kind of settle on a scope, and then at each stage of the kind of writing process or the story development, the sort of whatever concepts they're approaching or suggesting has to fit within the scope of what they've already decided as far as like the technical stuff. Yeah. Which is kind of interesting because like a lot of the time what happens is the writer for the game, well, this is how modern studios work at least, is someone who's writing the game story will be given, okay, we need you to write these 10 scenes, or we need you to write this, this bank of dialogue or whatever, and they'll write it, and then it'll go away, and the game director and whoever's in charge of making those decisions will then adapt it to suit what they need. Like, it's sort of a lot more vertical, whereas it sounds like with these guys, it's pretty horizontal. But the obvious biggest change here is that in Asylum, the whole game was limited to being on the island, whereas in Arkham City, there's this portion of Gotham that's cornered off that you can kind of play in. It's a much larger space as well.
Yeah.
And so once this decision was made, Paul Dini and Crocker pitched ideas for the central thrust of the story. They wrote a few treatments for these ideas, returned them to the design team, and Crocker then spent the time to break it out into scenes and gameplay segments to understand how and if these ideas could actually work in execution. I'm highlighting this in particular because the way Sefton Hill discusses Arkham City's process makes it sound like that Paul Dini is this like bridge between the game development ideas and these like OG comic book things. See, he's the guy where they're like, okay, well, we can only do this in the game. What can you tell us from the comics that could do that? Or, there's a big twist in that game, which is around the Joker's health. And they went to Dini and they were like, how do we make this work from a story? Like, what's the deal here? We kind of have this idea. How can we work this in? And so it seems like his background and connections, and as you said before, Nolan, like his huge knowledge of this universe, of the DC kind of mythos, made him like the perfect middleman, and he was able to take the best of both spectrums and combine them. And again, some of this is sort of speculation because you have to read between the lines of what these guys are saying. But here's Sefton Hill, who was the game director, talking about the plot of the game to The Guardian before its release. He said, quote, "We did know right at the start. Paul Dini flew over right at the start of the development with a guy from DC we work with very closely, and all of us kicked around ideas. We knew exactly where we wanted it to go, without getting into spoilers, right up to the end. We knew the major plot points, and as the game developed, we filled out the journey from there. So we started the game knowing 5 or 6 main beats, and the rest is down to the development process. There's a lot of stuff in the game which, if you play through it a second time, will make more sense the second time you play it, end quote. And he's obviously dancing around the Joker stuff very, very nicely. Did you have that experience going back to it? Like, was it...
Absolutely. It was so cool. They teased it, like, basically from the get-go, like the first time you see him. And it was... And I found it neat because I've played Arkham City probably like 8 or 9 times. Mm-hmm. And I feel like every time that I play through it, I notice something that wasn't there before that kind of hints at the big twist. And I think as far as the twist go, the twist was done in my eyes expertly, because they literally put it right under your nose.
It's so good, man. And it's so like you don't notice. Yeah, it's you don't notice it, and then the second you have the context, it's so cool to go back.
And you're like, how did I miss this?
Oh, it's exactly how twists in story should work. Like all of the exposition for it should be seeded, but until you know the twist, it's just sort of additional peripheral information. So good. The one scene that I'll never forget is where Harley's like, "Oh, it's you." There's that, I can't remember which scene it is, but it's so obvious that she thinks it's the other. She thinks it's Clayface the Joker, or vice versa. And that was when I was like, "Oh, something's going on here." Like that was when I was like, "Something's up." The first time playing through, and then going back and replaying that scene, I was like, "Damn, these guys are on that shit."
And what was cool is that Clayface was in Arkham Asylum.
Yeah,
he had
it's
that.
It's so good.
He was a little Easter egg.
There's another
one. So it's
one
not even a matter of working in, how are we going to do this in the story based on, your knowledge of the comics, but like even based on characters that have already been established in Arkham Asylum. Which
is why it was so weird to me. Which is why the Arkham Knight reveal was so weird. We'll talk about it more in part 2, but like,
oh yeah,
there's so many other opportunities that they could have done that cool, like, pull the rug out from under us in Arkham Knight, that they've got so much to work with that they just never tap into. But as we'll learn as we go a bit further into this story, maybe there's a reason why they couldn't. So from what I can tell, Arkham City's development was challenging and long, but relatively smooth. Similar to Asylum, DC kept their distance, as did Warner Brothers, letting the team do the work, as Rocksteady scaled up their staff during the last year and a half of development to get the game across the line. The game's biggest strengths were born from the slight reimaginings of existing characters. We meet an older Robin with this shaved head and a modern-looking suit. One of my favorite tidbits is Can Muftick, who was a senior concept artist, has talked about this a little bit and why this is his favorite Robin. And he kind of talked about this idea of we gave him a shaved head because we imagined that this kind of incarnation of Robin in his free time, he probably is going out and doing cage fights and stuff to keep his keep his edge and stuff like that. He's this guy who's going to put himself in increasing danger. And I just love little details like that every kind of, every costume decision and every choice they're making, they've thought about how the world has shaped that to come to be, Yeah. It wasn't just let's give him a shaved head because it'll look different. It's okay, but what would the reason be for that, and how would that fit into the character? Part of the reason is also they didn't have great hair physics, but
very true.
But it's that it's again that combination of gameplay and story where they're okay, there's a gameplay or a technological limitation here. How can we work around it? Which is it's what these games do tremendously well. You can see this deliberateness with all of the characters. Every minor detail integrates with efficiency, building this complex, realized impression of a functioning existing world. You get to see these great relationships between existing characters. I'm highlighting these details in particular because when we discuss Arkham Knight in the next episode, we'll be addressing where maybe some of this doesn't take place, and then the opposite where it's taken to its extreme. Now, on release, Arkham City was the fastest selling game of all time. It's been beaten since, but at the time, it shipped nearly 2 million units in its first week and a few months. By the way, 2.5 million was how many the first game sold in its first 2 months. This game has beaten it in its first 2 weeks.
That blows my mind.
Yeah, a few months later, it had sold more than 6 million units, which is just outrageous. At the time, weirdly, City's primary competition was Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, which is a weird thing to think about.
3?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, I thought it was 2, because when you mentioned like video game records, I thought for a while Modern Warfare 2 had held the record for fastest selling video game in like the first.
Oh, yeah,
bit.
I wasn't saying that it was the. Sorry, I didn't mean fastest selling. I meant its literal competition at the time of release, like the game that was trying to beat in that kind of calendar year. Yeah, well, but you're right. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 was beating it up until that point. But they were trying to beat COD 3, Modern Warfare 3 that holiday season, which they managed to beat in the first 12 months of sales. And this is fucking absurd to me. In the first year, they sold 12.5 million copies of Arkham City, and made somewhere in the ballpark, and this is an estimation of $600 million, which is just truly outrageous.
I'm now no longer surprised that Arkham Knight looks as good as it does when they're making that kind of money.
They had a lot of cash behind them. On the game, Stephen Totilo for Kotaku wrote the following, and I think this perfectly encapsulates the way this game was received. Quote, "Zoomed into Arkham City, there are very few modern gaming experiences that are superior to playing as Batman in Rocksteady's second Dark Knight effort. Dynamic, exciting, full of fun characters, stuffed with things to do, and built upon gameplay that is so good that it shines even when the bait of plot development and ability upgrading is removed. Arkham City is a magnificent game that merely risks, as far as Batman games go, being unstoppable." Unquote. Untoppable, rather. I can read. This is also the game that generated the famous line from Greg Miller. Shout outs all of my game crit nerds out there. Do you know the infamous line that his review spawned from this particular video game?
No, actually. I know of Greg Miller, and I used to watch a lot of his IGN reviews back when he was with them. But no, I don't remember exactly what it was.
He was the one that infamously said that the game made you feel like Batman.
He's the guy?
He's the guy. He's the feel like Batman guy.
Oh my god.
Yeah, so it's followed him around ever since, which is
he
quite
must
funny
hate that.
Yeah, he's not a big fan. He's not a big fan.
Like, he's right, but
he's right. Yeah, and also he's an incredibly talented journalist. But it's tough that's what's stuck. Yeah, so he's the feel like Batman guy, and he's not wrong. But like, what a tough meme to get stuck to you for the rest of your working career.
Like, whoever whoever wrote the review for Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire and said too much water.
Yeah,
that guy's gotta hate the internet.
Yeah. Which again, like, it's a fair criticism. And as you know, feel like Batman is also like a really good way of describing what's happening. It's just the internet's awful. And I think outlets like IGN happen to attract the lowest common denominator, and unfortunately that means that these kinds of things happen a lot.
Yeah.
Which is tough. And yeah, I know it's trite, but I think Miller was on the money. The developers set out to communicate what being Batman in Gotham should feel like, at least impressionistically, and I think they achieved it.
Well, and that's what a Batman game should be. Like, you should feel like you're playing as Batman.
And I think the funny thing, man, is like, with superhero games, it's really hard because what makes a specific superhero or comic book character feel like them, Superman games have been historically bad because it's hard to make a good game where you fly around and feel like you're actually Superman. Some of them have come pretty close, like the 64, and then some of the DS games have been okay, but like, it's tricky because flight is a weird thing to simulate, whereas like Batman's just limited enough in his abilities that if you can give someone the impression of feeling like this predator and this like force of nature, that's the thing that matters. You don't have to directly kind of be one-to-one, it's like in the comics,
Yeah, and Batman is a little more, I think, in his abilities, he's a little more relatable, I would say. I don't mean relatable in the sense that I jump off a fucking building and start gliding, but I mean that, like, I can see myself throwing a batarang. I could see, like, the moves that he's doing and whatnot, like, you could see that in real life to some extent. But with Superman, it's like, I couldn't even imagine what it's like to fly or to shoot lasers out of my eyes. And so I think that kind of...
Yeah, and that's sort of what Nolan tapped into in his trilogy as well, is like Batman can be anyone. That's sort of the point of him. it pales in comparison to how well Sam Raimi's Spider-Man films tried to capture that idea that like Spider-Man could be anyone. But I think, yeah, he's an interesting character to want to adapt, and I think they did a phenomenal job. And you know, the tricky thing is, and we might talk about it a bit next episode, but there was this talk of this sequel to the Arkham series that sounded really fucking cool to me, which was like this kind of open world, post-apocalyptic style game set in Gotham where you're playing as like Damian Wayne. And it's kind of, they were talking about it, styling it similar to the Mad Max video game, where it's like, you know, you kind of go from area to area and it's sort of this desolate kind of version of Gotham. And it sounded really cool and interesting to me because it was like, you know, complete reimagining of this setting. But then you look at what they did with Knight and how conclusive they wanted that to be. And I'm almost like, I wonder, because they've got that new game coming out that's set in the same universe. Gotham Knights, which is sort of this, it's sort of a Destiny style MMO looking thing. Which is certainly a choice.
Look,
certainly...
I don't mind the choice. I just think, you know, allow me to get on a high horse for a second. I think people are overreacting about it. I think it's gonna. I have faith in the developers. I don't really have. I think people really get turned off by damage numbers and stuff like that because they assume that it's going to be some sort of like what's that model called? The Destiny model.
Yeah, like the looty shooty.
No, it's called MMO? Something. No, it's son of a bitch. It's where they keep rolling out free content.
Games as service.
Games as service, yeah, and I can see where that worry comes from, but I think I feel like they could do a good job as long as they don't fall into those holes, and I don't think they will. But
no, either way, I just want to like whip around Gotham on a biker's back door. Like that just sounds like fun. Yeah, that just sounds fun to me. I think the concern. Well, so the concern makes sense to me, but I don't necessarily share the same reticence just because of things like damage numbers.
Well, and they've gone on record like on Twitter and whatnot. And they've said like, oh, we're not doing that. It's not going to be games as a service.
Yeah, it could just be like an RPG more.
Yeah.
Which I don't have a problem with. I'm a giant RPG nerd. I've just finished replaying Wasteland 3 for the 4th time.
I'm not a huge RPG guy, but I don't mind them. I just... Yeah, I guess also looking at YouTube comments for seeing how people feel about the game is like probably the worst thing I could do.
Well, people are very rational on the internet, Nolan, so I don't know what you'd be talking about there.
Yeah, but even the top comments though seem pretty concerned about it, but
yeah,
I have faith.
I think that's just what people do, man.
And sorry to go on a bit of a tangent. I want to know, how would you feel about getting another Arkham game with the same combat, stealth, yada yada? Hopefully no Batmobile.
I don't really know why they're not doing one every 2 years. Like they should have just gone with the Assassin's Creed model, in my opinion, and just been like, okay, we'll do one every 2 years. It'll be a different Batman one shot each time. We'll just like recreate a different comic book. Like I don't understand why that isn't the model they went with. I just think they'd be printing money. We'll do it as like an episodic games as service thing, where it's like every year we release another, you know, main story campaign. So I don't know. That's what I thought they were gonna do. I think I've had my fill of this type of game. I think replaying Spider-Man PS4 has solidified for me that I think I'm done with this stuff. Like when I beat Miles Morales, I was like, all right, I'm good for now. I'm good on this particular Arkham genre. I'm okay, I think.
I didn't get that same feeling when I played Spider-Man PS4. I didn't really feel like it was an Arkham game. I felt like it was more, it's a superhero action game, so there's going to be an overlap regardless of how unique it is. But I feel like, especially with combat where it saw the most comparisons, I felt like Spider-Man, it was more you were focusing on like individual enemies, like one at a time, while in Arkham you are like a fucking pinball just bouncing around the room. And
yeah, it's also a different, it's more like Devil May Cry, where it's like the goal is to be keeping people off the ground.
Yeah,
depending on like it's a bit different,
mixing in gadgets and whatnot.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's why I was asking, because once I had replayed all the Arkham games over the course of the last like year or so, I realized that I don't think I want another Arkham game, because I was thinking that too. It's like, why would they go in this RPG like direction? And I'm kind of thinking, as much as I may not as much as I'm skeptical about it kind of off the bat, I feel like I don't want another Arkham game, because I think they've sort of exhausted that formula. There's not much more that they can do to improve the combat or stealth, at least in my eyes. And I've had lots of conversations about it with my friends and whatnot, about like what more could... Yeah, they can always do a different story in a different world and whatnot, but traversal, you already move like a speeding bullet in Night. I mean, stealth and combat, it's like, I don't know how you could improve on that, because they've basically perfected it in my eyes.
I completely agree. I think with Night, perfecting it is the right word. Like, it is just this polished fucking unit of game. Yeah, it really is. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know what it's kind of like the Assassin's Creed series sometimes, where it's like they did that one thing and they did it to the point where it was like, okay, this is so polished, but now there's nothing left to do, so let's do something different. Which is fine. You can do that, but
the issue now is everybody's saying, fuck, go back.
Well, I feel like that's what's happening with the Arkham series. It's the same thing. It's like, I guess we're going to try something new. And everyone's like, no, this isn't what we asked for. We want the old stuff.
But then when you make the old stuff, there's going to be another group of people that are saying, hey, try something new. We've seen this before.
Yeah.
And so I feel like you get to a point where you can't please anyone. And I think I am happy that the Arkham series is just gone. Like, that's it. It's done. Rocksteady can make more Batman games, like they're making that Suicide Squad game, but it's not going to be an Arkham game, and I think that that's probably the best way to do it, because if they were to expand on the series, they would eventually get as divided as Assassin's Creed, where Assassin's Creed Valhalla, I saw was praised a lot for its story and that it's going back to its roots in a way. But for me personally, as someone who's played all of the... when I say go back to its roots, I don't mean like all the way, but I mean like they brought back the Hidden Blade. There's actual assassins in the game, and people praise it for that. But for me, I mean, as someone who's played the series almost since the beginning, like since Assassin's Creed 2 onward, it's like I've seen Assassins versus Templars, and Valhalla is basically just doing that same conflict, of course under different names. They're now the Hidden Ones versus the Order of the Ancients, and it's like it's the same shit. They're spouting the same ideas. Pardon?
It's just Origins, man. It's just Origins, man. They just redid Origins pretty much with the...
Yeah, and it's like, so story-wise, it's like, yeah, is it good? Yes. Is it good the 11th time in a row? Not really. Like, it's... I'd like to see something new. I'd rather them try something new and fail than do the same thing again, but at the same quality.
I agree. I think the issue is they did that and it didn't work out. So they did that with Unity, where they were like, okay, here's time for something completely different. And they fucked it up because there was too much pressure on them to release it when it wasn't ready, because shareholders. And the shareholders freaked out because they lost a ton of money. And then they were like, okay, never try anything new ever again. Just try and make The Witcher 3. That game sold well. And that seems to me to be their approach now, is like, let's be a combination of like The Witcher 3, Shadow of Mordor, and Assassin's Creed, and let's just do that until we work out what we want to do. And I'm fine with that, but I think to circle back to the Arkham stuff, I think the point you made there that is interesting to me, which is them taking a risk versus just retreading something that's been done previously. And the thing that made Arkham Asylum and Arkham City really, truly good is that both in the gameplay and whether or not you agree with some of the story choices in City, which a lot of people are kind of iffy on, particularly structurally, it's quite weird. At least everything there is like, they're trying something new. Like, there's a lot of big swings in that story that are really interesting. Like, in particular, you know, Batman kind of brutalizing Freeze repeatedly, really interesting to me. Like, it kind of takes that character of Bruce Wayne and really like pushes him in a way that I've just like it felt very fresh to me, because they did take those risks. Even if those risks didn't pay off, at least they were trying. And I think that's maybe where I feel with Arkham Knight, they lost some of their teeth in that sense. So when you ask if I want to see a new one, the answer is yes, but only if they had a fresh, interesting idea that was worthy of doing.
Yeah.
Like for instance, like that concept art that we saw, which is like, the kind of more post-apocalyptic style Gotham. I just think that'd be cool because it sounds different and interesting. You could kind of go down the route of like, in Zack Snyder's Justice League, or I think it's BVS even, you get those flash forwards to like, Batman in Apocalypse, and it looks cool, man. I'm like, that looks fun. So, I'm not against them trying something different. I think the worst thing they could do is be like, okay, wait 5 years and do like a reboot, and be like, this one's just called Arkham, Batman Arkham or something.
God.
Because that's going to happen eventually.
And you mentioned that, City kind of did something different with its storytelling. And I want to clarify that, while we're just sitting here basically sucking off City, City also took, I swear to God, everything from Asylum and just did it again, but better.
Yeah.
And like, I really appreciate that. So it's like, it's not that I don't like seeing the same idea done twice. It's just I don't like seeing the same idea done twice at the exact same level of quality and at the exact same depth, because City is literally Asylum, but just way better. Yeah. And that's not to say Asylum was bad, but you get what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, but Asylum, it's like with every studio it was that first big title, really.
Yeah.
They were finding their feet, they were kind of, tailoring their version of the Unreal Engine. I completely agree. That's enough praise for City, I'm sure. I will read one more thing from it, and then we'll take a quick break and come back. Just want to let you know that this is one of my favorite things ever, which is it's from the Australian official PlayStation magazine, which gave this game a perfect score of 10. I remember reading this when it came out, and there's a quote that I want to read you from it, which is, the game is, quote, "Not only the best superhero game ever made, it's one of the best games ever made. It brings the Caped Crusaders world to life better than any comic, movie, or television show before it." End quote. The reason I read you that quote is I think it's really important before we kind of duck away for our break and then come back to talk about the road into Arkham Knight, is that Arkham City was like, this was, as far as sophomore hits go, this was the home run, right? Yeah. They were looking to secure their position in the industry, and they literally, like, they've hit every single target they need to with this. They've exceeded Warner Brothers' expectations. They've exceeded everyone's expectations, to be completely honest. And also one thing that they did really well at the time is they were very, very, very supportive of content creators who, they sent out all of these early codes for Arkham City, to YouTubers, and people like that, and they let them play it early and showcase the game early. And it gave this level of confidence for the product that otherwise wouldn't have been present.
Now we have Cyberpunk, where reviewers are not allowed to use their own footage.
Yep. Let's talk about that more in part 2, because that is gonna, boy, I like
that quote a lot. Sorry, but I was just saying I like that quote a lot because I think we've talked a lot about how well it blended the comic Batman with like this Arkham Batman, and how it's such a good superhero game, especially when superhero games were just not a very strong subgenre at the time. I mean, like you said, there's not a lot of good Superman games. I can't even think of one. I can only think of maybe like 4 or 5 good Spider-Man games at that time. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's important to also remember that like this is not only a really good superhero game, but it's just a really good video game in general. Yeah. And it's like even someone like myself whose only exposure to the character was Asylum and the movies, and it's like I don't know who Doctor Strange is. I barely know who Mr. Freeze is. It's like I was still able to enjoy it, and it was still really just an awesome time, even if you for both people who love the comics and people who are a huge fan and people who are just kind of new to the series.
Absolutely. And I think that's the difference, is it made people into Batman fans as well. This is like DC's best case scenario. Especially with Chris Nolan pumping out his Dark Knight trilogy around the same time. This is like peak DC hitting their stride. It's the right era for it. It's just working really well. So we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to talk a bit about what the next... They have to make this big decision, right? Basically what happened was Warner Brothers and Eidos had just been happy for the studio to truck along. They just kind of left Rocksteady to their own devices. But the outrageous critical and particularly commercial success of Arkham City pricked their ears. Suddenly they smelled franchise potential. They sort of went, okay, this could be this could be big. And so as Arkham City hit the shelves, Rocksteady looked within their ranks, and they had a decision to make. So we'll take a quick break, and we'll come back and we'll talk about what exactly that decision was and how it affected the sequel they were going to start developing, Arkham Knight. So enjoy whatever product it is you're about to hear an advertisement for. Go and purchase it if you like. If you don't like, we'll be right back. We'll be talking about the controversial shit that's about to go down at Rocksteady, and some of the drama that led to the development of Arkham Knight. So we'll see you guys in after these good products. Hey guys, this video is sponsored by the Maynard Trigg series. That is my novel series. It's kind of a low sci-fi fantasy coming of age story, and this episode specifically is brought to you by the sequel, Maynard Trigg and the City of Whispers. It is the explosive sequel to the original story and follows our heroes after the events of the first book. If you enjoyed the first one, or you like the kinds of stories that we talk about and the way we tell them, I guarantee you'll like these stories. Head to maynardtrigg.com to find out more and grab your copy today. Welcome back to the program. Hope you enjoyed them products, and if you bought them, good for you. So with their sophomore efforts so wildly successful, the expectations on Rocksteady were, as you can imagine, massive. They hadn't even started talking about a sequel, and it was already there was a lot of opinions being thrown around, is the impression I get. So sometime around 2012, Warner Brothers and Rocksteady, they knew they wanted to make a sequel to Arkham City, but they had no idea what that might look like, no idea how to approach it, no idea when they were going to do this, right? And this uncertainty, I can't work out why this is the case. It seems to me that it would have made sense for them to just immediately launch into making a sequel. Part of the reason they didn't is that they knew the new consoles were coming out soon. So they knew that in about 2 to 3 years, they would have the new consoles dropping. And they kind of were, do we do it on the new platform? Do we do it on the old one? What do we do here? And so around 2012, with this uncertainty, Warner Brothers and Rocksteady suggest to Paul Dini that he should seek other work in the meantime. They're like, listen, we don't know what we're doing. See if you can get some work. We're not going to start making a sequel straight away.
So sorry, you said they didn't know what they wanted to do with the sequel?
Yeah. And,
they didn't know story-wise?
I think they had an idea story-wise. They didn't know what they wanted to do technological-wise. They didn't know if they wanted to start developing it for the current gen, which was the 360, or for the next ones, which was the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4.
Yeah, because I know Hush was teased at the end of, not at the end of Arkham City, but during a side quest in Arkham City. He was kind of teased that he would be returning.
In the same way that with City and Asylum, they knew that they had a lot of threads they were going to pull through narratively.
Gotcha.
It was more from a technological perspective and a project planning perspective. They just weren't really sure what their plan was.
Gotcha.
And so they sort of, I've done a lot of digging on this, and I couldn't really find anything substantial, but they basically tap Paul Dini on the shoulder, and they just say, look, man, just find something else in the meantime. And I can't tell if that's them being like, find something else but not bringing you back, or if that's them being like, it's a really uncertain future. I couldn't verify either way. So at this
maybe
point,
they were trying to make it as I guess ambiguous as possible.
That's my impression. As always is the case on this show, when video game studios part ways with employees or freelancers or anyone critical to their projects, the more silence there is, the larger it speaks to what happened. I couldn't find any verification that Rocksteady and Dini had a falling out. Nor did Dini have any issues with DC. He kept working with them and wrote a handful of Batman books after that. He did, though, pivot to writing Ultimate Spider-Man and Hulk and the Agents of Smash pretty soon afterwards. And there's some speculation that him signing this work influenced Rocksteady and DC's decision. But this feels more like pure speculation to me, the more I've kind of looked into it. More than likely, what the impression I've got is they didn't really have a timeline. Dini had to find work. He found some stuff and then committed and kind of couldn't come back. That's generally the accepted narrative. There is an alternative, which we'll talk about in a second. But for the most part, I'm willing to believe that was what happened. But
okay.
Regardless, Paul Dini departs the Arkham franchise at this stage, which leaves a pretty big hole in their sort of critical structure, right? This is the guy who was so instrumental in helping them adapt all of these ideas to the game, and he just had this like vision of comics and this knowledge that we've talked about. And so instead, Rocksteady lent on Sefton Hill and Ian Ball, who started working with Martin Lancaster and Jeff Johns as consultants for the story. Now, this is before they've decided how they're going to make it. They're still just in the pitching stage, right? So Hill and Ball pitched their idea for Arkham Knight to Warner Brothers, which is this next-gen kind of physics-heavy showcase that would cover the entirety of Gotham, not just one area. And Warner Brothers agreed with this vision, but pointed out that 3 years would be too long between games after the huge success of City. They didn't just want to let the ball drop. So it was that Warner Brothers Montreal began development on Arkham Origins, a prequel to Asylum, which explored Batman's early career. Now, without Dini's involvement in either project, Origins was received relatively well, but generally overlooked. Most people said that it was perfectly fine. The gameplay offered little way, sort of evolutionary-wise, it was kind of the same. And it was largely a limitation of being being a prequel and also being on the same engine as City.
Yeah,
So
and
kind of
that's
limited.
and that kind of speaks to what we mentioned before on how the big thing for City that a lot of people, including myself, liked was that it improved on everything from Arkham Asylum, but it seemed like Origins kind of had that issue of, was it good? Yeah. Was it good a second time around? It's like okay, yeah, this is good stuff, but we've had it now for the second time, so I think that's what kind of held it back most, if anything. But I think at least it had a unique story.
Yeah, that's it. And they went for something, and they kind of swung at it. And to what extent it worked, your mileage is going to vary. But, it was enough to tie over most fans. But critically for Warner Brothers, it kept the money flowing. They made enough from City, but for them, it was about, okay, well, how do we consistently generate revenue from this? Again, like we said earlier, they saw that franchise potential, and they weren't willing to let it go just yet. It did, however, stoke even more interest in the next mainline game. People were curious to see what Rocksteady would do. So something I always do for these scripts and this podcast is whenever a new name comes up, I tend to do I do a deep dive into that person. Because it's good to help for context of knowing that person's career and how they slot into the project we're discussing, but also in case there's anything that's really interesting that kind of comes up. So I'm going to talk to you about Jeff Johns for a minute. And I mentioned earlier that Johns was brought on to consult with Arkham Knight, but that's not really the full story of him coming onto the project and Dini leaving. So at the time of Arkham Knight's production, Jeff Johns was the chief creative officer of DC Entertainment, and very recently at the time. And Johns has a storied career. It's pretty similar to Dini's in some ways, actually. But where Dini worked primarily on animation, Johns worked far more on television and film. He was involved in projects like Smallville, The Flash, and Titans. He also did some bad ones. He produced Green Lantern. He was a primary creative lead on 2017's Justice League, and is very unfortunately credited for writing the screenplay of Wonder Woman 1984. But Johns did a lot of amazing stuff too. He collaborated on Batman Earth 1. He instituted the New 52, which was sort of the relaunch of the DC franchise, a precursor to the far better Rebirth series, and generally helped reshape the modern era of DC and DC Comics. For the most part, Johns is credited with the introduction of... So he's the guy who comes onto these properties and tries to tie them into the larger universe, wants them to feel part of something, right? He introduced the Legion of Superheroes in Smallville, and was an advocate for driving that series toward opening up its universe as it went on into its later seasons. My point ultimately here is that Rocksteady brought on the guy famous for wanting to make things interconnected, and he was really invested in constructing these multi-layered worlds where you kind of have to read all the issues to really get the full picture. But it's hard to tell if they brought him on or if he went, well, I'm the chief creative officer. This thing is going to make us a lot of money. I'm getting involved. Dini's out. I'm in. Yeah. That's the other narrative here, that there's potential as to how that went down. To what extent that's likely, I mean, that shit happens a lot when someone comes in. He's reshaping his team and he's kind of reshaping their priorities. So it seems to me and would make logical sense that he's come on as the chief creative officer. He doesn't want this legacy stuff tying them down. It's okay, this is my ship now. We're going to do this my way. Whether or not that's the case, hard to say. Regardless, we reach the development of Arkham Knight. And there's some leaks and stuff that I won't get too much into. But the first trailer released on the 4th of March 2014 and sets up the game's premise. Scarecrow has taken over Gotham, and we see this Batman who is at the apex of his career and must kind of go out and stop him. And from this first glimpse, it's clear that tonally this is a completely different product, right? It's far more somber, it's far more serious. The trailer features a voiceover of Thomas Wayne reading his last will and testament to his son, which is already kind of a dark place to start. Yeah. Next episode, we'll be talking about the game itself in complete detail. We'll step through the basic story beats to understand what's going on, to understand what's working and what isn't. We'll talk about the gameplay. We'll talk about the themes. But before we wrap up and move into part 2, we need to talk about the game's release. So I want to silo this to the end of this part because I don't necessarily think it should impact a discussion of the final product. For those unaware, Arkham Knight released on the 25th of June 2015 for PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. It was perfect and everybody loved it and nothing went wrong the whole time.
Nope.
Yeah, because it released on PC and it didn't work and still doesn't.
It still doesn't?
It's not really, no.
Oh, man.
I was playing it this week in research for this and still got some issues, man.
Wow.
I played the game the night of its release at midnight on my brand new GTX 970 graphics card. Top of the line, baby. And boy, was this video game fucking broken. I'm not a big like frame rate guy or like a graphics. I'm not even like a real gamer, to be honest. If the game looks and runs okay, I'm cool with it, you know. Yeah. But the PC release just like didn't really like work. It's really hard to explain the experience of it. I'll pop up some footage, but
yeah, I saw. I remember because one of the first things I saw for Arkham Knight was a angry rant from Angry Joe. About the PC port of the game, and that gave me a pretty good idea. I heard it crashed a ton, graphical errors everywhere, things just wouldn't work.
Yep.
And yeah.
The physics, it was a lot of like physics weird stuff where like physics particles would frequently, as you said, cause the game to crash, or would just like get out of sync with the rest of the game and do really weird shit that broke it. There was a particular glitch which basically made the game unplayable, where as you were gliding, Batman would sort of constantly be dipping and diving, and he couldn't really glide. It was very weird. And Warner Brothers actually suspended the sales of the Windows version so they could fix the issues and offered refunds. 3 days later, they dropped a patch which solved a lot of the actual hard crashing, but didn't address any of the performance problems. To make things worse, it turns out in the time since that Warner Brothers knew about these problems well ahead of the release. So I'm going to read you a quote from Attack of the Fanboy in some of their discovery around what went wrong with Arkham Knight. Quote, according to Batman Arkham Knight's credits, Iron Galaxy Studios was in charge of additional engineering and PC support for Batman Arkham Knight. Under this section, only 12 team members are listed, which is hard to believe for a full PC version of a game that was supposed to be alongside the console versions. With the launch console's troubles so far, this seems to have been almost an afterthought with the outsourcing of this version. End quote. So they get an independent team to come in that's far too small, they under-resource them, and they're shocked when it doesn't work. Now, there is a solution to this, obviously, which is you just delay the PC release. This is what Rockstar did with Grand Theft Auto 5 and with Red Dead Redemption 2. They are famous for, I mean, obviously for them there's a commercial motivator too, because it means that we'll all buy it a second time, but also it means that the game comes out and it actually works and it's pretty polished. They had some hitches with Red Dead 2, but for the most part this is how game developers should be approaching these ports if they're not sort of built for PC.
Yeah.
Now as time went on, different testers and people came out of the woodwork, and speaking with Kotaku, I'll just read you a quote here. I will say that it's pretty rich for Warner Brothers to act like they had no idea the game was in such a horrible state, said one quality assurance tester who worked on the game for years. It's been like this for months, and all the problems we see now were the exact same, unchanged, almost a year ago. And then continuing the article, 2 sources requesting anonymity to avoid jeopardizing their careers spoke with Kotaku over the past week in the hopes of explaining how broken the PC version of Arkham Knight made it out the door.
That's how you know it's bad. When they don't want to put their name to it, that's...
Dude, that's how you know, man. They both said that Warner Brothers was aware of many issues facing Arkham Knight on PC, and said that the publisher chose to ship the game regardless, not to maniacally screw over customers, but because they believed it was good enough. End quote. Wow, it's incredible to me. Like, Warner Brothers just didn't give a fuck. They were like,
you want to know
whatever.
something funny? That completely reminds me of when I worked at a grocery store and I was stocking shelves and I'm pulling these bananas out of a box and I'm throwing them on the shelf. And I get this one, it's got mold on it. Mm-hmm. And so I tell the manager, I'm like, hey, what should I do with this one? This batch has mold all over it. He's like, oh, fuck it, put it on there. Somebody's going to buy it. And it just reminds me of that. He just thought, like, yeah, it's fine.
Fuck it.
And that's just the same thing.
Those nerds will buy it.
Yeah.
Give a shit.
Like,
yeah.
Oh,
what a choice. God. Imagine knowing how bad it was and then just doing it anyway.
Yeah, just selling it.
And look, we can only really speculate, but in the same Kotaku article, there is some peripheral information that might explain why this happened the way it did. And this maybe speaks to, again, Jeff Johns being on the project of Paul Dini not. So, quote, one unexpected problem, the game's secretive story. Rocksteady was deeply afraid of plot revelations being leaked ahead of release, said the same source. So traditional PC testing firms that are used to stress test games on different hardware configurations, one of PC's biggest hurdles, were avoided. From what I'm told, this is not uncommon practice for major video games with story-heavy elements, end quote. So in order to not have the story leaked, they chose not to test their PC version, basically.
Oh, man.
Which is, like, super cool. It's just like, because obviously the biggest hurdle, just a bit of behind baseball, the biggest hurdle for PC game development, as it's been explained to me from the game developers I know, is that it's not that getting it, you can get it running on most things. It's the sheer number of different hardware configurations mean that you have to build in really, really robust kind of foundations for this stuff. Like, it's a lot of reworking a lot of your kind of base code to make sure that it's going to operate on anything and on with, you know, X amount of resources or X types of resources.
Yeah.
And that's why you hire these firms that can test on a huge array of different configurations of platforms. And it lets you make decisions like, what are our minimum recommended specs and information like that. But this decision, in my opinion, is hubris in every single form. It's the arrogance to assume that your story is so good that it's worth risking a third of your consumers receiving an unplayable copy of your product.
Oh, man.
It legitimately took months for the PC port to become usable, but even today it still runs like absolute dog shit. And sometimes doesn't work. I can get 90 frames a second, but there's still the occasional frame hitch, complete freeze up, or the weird desynchronization of the physics within the game's engine. Certain areas totally tank the frame rate for absolutely no reason. Like, they're not hyper-dense or anything, they just do. While some of the most graphically dense moments of the story run at like a buttery smooth 120 frames. It's just built on a faulty foundation. But despite these issues, the game's 20-something hours of gameplay are still some of the most fascinating, engaging, best-looking time that you can spend in Gotham. So next episode, we're going to tackle the game, chat through it beat by beat, and pick apart what's going on, what's working, and what it's all really about. Given the game's themes, it's ever more complicated that Dini, the man responsible for setting up the world of Arkham, was not a part of this game. That Paul Dini left, and his legacy was the Joker's death, makes me wonder, does Arkham Knight reimagine and re-evolve, or just force life back into a story that had already been kind of concluded by Dini? So for now, I'll leave you with this, which is a quote from Simon Miller in writing for Vice Games back in 2016, before Waypoint took over. And Simon says, quote, "The ultimate praise, however, even with the countless missions, thugs to punch in the face, and iconic villains to track down, is that there is as much to take away from the Arkhamverse simply by exploring what it has to offer. A simulator by any other name, each version of Gotham can be delved into as a spectacular, holding a sense of fascination and entertainment that most games struggle to achieve at all. Rocksteady has proven time and time again that they are world-building extraordinaires. The fact that they managed to do that while dealing with something truly as special as Batman is just the icing on the cake." End quote. I think that's exactly right. It's that they are so good and it just happened to be Batman. But look, that's part one, wrapped up in a nice little bow. We've got to the end of the road. We've got to Arkham Knight. We're gonna get really stuck into it next time. Is there anything that you want to plug? Where can people find you on the internet?
Just like my channel, you can just find it. It's ThatBoyAqua. I just review games. I don't come to me looking for a critic though, because I'm not very I wouldn't say I'm very formal in my reviews. I more just kind of talk about what I like and don't like in probably too much detail.
Mm-hmm. That's the way to do it. I don't know any other way.
Yeah.
I mean, and you've got a video on Arkham Knight. You've got one on City and Asylum. Have you covered Origins yet? Yeah, you have, haven't you?
Yeah, I covered Origins. I'm probably gonna. I wouldn't say I have a video on Asylum because my video on Asylum is really bad. It was when I first started making reviews. So I'm probably gonna redo that one at some point. So there will be something like that. I have the season pass for Arkham Origins and Arkham Knight reviewed as well. And if you guys are interested in any Assassin's Creed stuff, I reviewed I think half of the series by now.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, definitely go check it out.
And I appreciate you for having me on the show. It's cool.
It's been my pleasure. It's been my pleasure. I'm very excited for part 2. We can get real nerdy and talk about video games in too much detail, which is what we do best here. If you want to find us, we're ZeroIndent everywhere. Trying to think what else I even need to plug. It's hard because I don't have that many projects at the moment. You can buy my books at maynardtrig.com if you like the way that we talk about stuff and you like the kind of stories we discuss. Chances are you'll like that series. Otherwise, you can follow me on Twitter at DCMIHatePie, and I think that's pretty much it. Otherwise, we'll see you guys in part 2 for another exciting bout of some Batman discussions. We'll catch you guys then.